Hey guys, welcome back to Reignited and our series where I'm trying to build the ultimate Hemi-powered daily driver, make this thing as reliable as it can possibly be, fix any of the weak points with it. Now in our last episode you saw that I took care of the exhaust leaks that these vehicles have by installing a set of aftermarket shorty headers. In this episode, you guys already saw a thumbnail, you know we are installing a high volume oil pump and we're going to be doing an MDS delete. Stay with me. Just a couple of quick points here before we jump into the meat of the matter in installing that pump. If you haven't seen me before, my name is Sky. I've been a Dodge technician for the last 15 years. So this type of work is kind of my bread and butter. It's what I do all the time. Now for this video specifically, I know right off the rip, it's going to be a very long video because I'm going to go ahead and put everything into this one video. So I know your guys' time is valuable as well. So I've split this video up into chapters. If you look in the video description down below, you can jump ahead to the chapters that most interest you or what you most want to see. With that being said though, I would greatly appreciate it if you do end up watching the entire video all the way through. That really helps me out. Along with that, if you can like the video, comment down below if you feel like I'm providing good value for you in this video. Another quick point I want to make here is that while I am not being paid by Melling for making this video, I am now an affiliate for Summit Racing. So throughout the video, you're going to see some links pop up, whether it's going to be in the upper right corner here, or I will have them listed in the description down below. And those links will be taking you to Summit Racing for either the parts that we're using this to install or for the tools that are required to do the job. Now, if you use those links and buy those parts from Summit, it won't cost you anything extra, but it is another way you can show some support for me. But I do have some good news for you guys. If you're watching this video the same week that it comes out, today is November 28th, 2025, and going through December 3rd of 2025, Summit Racing is having a promo going on where you can save up to $80 off your order by entering the code CYBER on checkout. Now, it'll come as no surprise to most of you that we are once again working with Melling on this particular project. They have sent out these parts. I've been so happy to work with them. They've been a fantastic company, and they're really looking to help you guys out as well with these offerings. Now, the pump that we have here is their M452HV pump. This is the high volume pump for either a 5.7 or a 6.4 liter engine from 2009 to present. This is a direct fit replacement for all of those engines. 6.1 guys, you're going to be using a different pump. I'll go ahead and list which one down in the description down below. But 5.7 or 6.4 from 09 to current, this is the pump you want, especially if you are going to be keeping your MDS system, which I do recommend in most cases. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. But this has a stock oil pressure relief spring in it, so it won't set any kind of a code and your MDS system will continue to work properly. But it still gives you the high volume properties at idle, which we're actually looking for. Now, just a little bit more information about this Melling high volume pump. A few of you might say, well, how much more volume are we talking about? Well, it's essentially about 12% more than the stock pump is. Essentially, this is basically giving you the exact same output as a Hellcat pump would if you were to swap that onto your vehicle. However, there's a couple of benefits that I feel like come with this particular pump. Number one is that it comes with that correct oil spring already installed. So you don't have to mess with that. It's just bolted on and go, which is nice. And importantly, this is actually a lot cheaper generally than the Hellcat pump will be from a dealership. And it's generally more available as well. So a couple of nice benefits that come with getting this particular pump. Now for this particular project, we are actually going to be deleting the MDS system, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, why I've made that decision. But for right now, the Melling system that we're working with, their MDS delete kit, it's a very complete kit. It comes with a Non MDS camshaft. It comes with brand new Johnson lifters, of course, Non MDS style. It comes with the new yokes that are necessary when you're switching to Non MDS lifters. It comes with the plugs that you install in place of the MDS solenoids, and it comes with all new push rods. So it's a very complete kit for deleting this system. Something that's kind of crazy to me is that it's been over 4 years since I first made that video talking about the idea of adding a high volume pump to a Hemi engine to help with these lifter issues. Now, in that time since then, I have made a number of other videos talking about this issue, doing as much research as I can, giving you guys as much accurate and up-to-date information as I can regarding why I think this is a beneficial modification to do for your Hemi engine. And I feel like it's kind of come full circle at this point. It seems like most people out there have heard of this as a mod to do for their engine. In fact, one of the most hilarious things to me is that oftentimes on my own videos, I will get people commenting and telling me, hey, you need to add a high volume pump to that Hemi engine. So I think it's kind of funny how that works. Now, if you want some much more detailed information on why I feel like these high volume oil pumps are a beneficial modification to make to your Hemi, go ahead and watch this video right here, or I will link it in the description down below. It'll explain it much more clearly. But as a quick primer, I realized a number of years ago that a lot of these vehicles I was doing cam and lifter repairs on were vehicles that had extended idle times, fleet type vehicles or police vehicles where they're just sitting idling all the time. Now, the way the oil pumps work on these engines, that's basically the least oil flow you're going to get through the engine is at idle. So you spend a bunch of time there. It seemed like it was really affecting these vehicles. So my thought process was, hey, if we can force some additional oil flow through the engine at idle, that can be nothing but beneficial. So that was kind of the basis for that. But again, watch that other video if you want to have much more information about it. Okay, quickly I want to cover just a few different common misconceptions or myths about this system. Number one myth, that the camshaft is lubricated through crank splash only. That was a common one going around for a while. That is absolutely not true. The Gen-3 Hemi engine has drilled oil passageways that provide pressurized oil directly to the lifter bores and thus to the cam lobes themselves as well. So it is not reliant on crank splash. Myth number two, MDS is the cause of lifter failure. Guys, I am on record in multiple videos saying that I do not believe this is true, even a little bit. I know a lot of people are convinced that this is the case. They say, well, it's always the MDS lifters that are failing. Number one, that is not true. My research has not borne that out to be the case. Number two, even on the manual transmission vehicles, even my own that I had that do not have MDS at all, they were still experiencing lifter failure. So MDS, guys, not the cause of this lifter failure. So that's why I say it's not critical that you delete the MDS in your vehicle, but it is appropriate in certain scenarios like we're going to talk about later with this vehicle. Myth number three, people will tell me that switching to a heavier weight oil will accomplish the same thing as putting on a high volume pump because your pressure goes up. Now, to understand why this is a myth, we need to understand what we're actually trying to accomplish here. The pressure number increasing is simply a byproduct of the high volume pump. It's not what we're actually after. Now, pressure is simply a reflection of resistance to flow. So obviously, if you have oil in a system and then you put in heavier weight oil, that's going to make it harder for that oil to move through the system and the pressure number is going to be higher. But you fundamentally change nothing about the actual amount of oil moving through the system. Whereas if we stick with the factory recommended viscosity, but we're adding more volume, then the pressure goes up because we're forcing more of that oil through the system. So a lot of times people will say, well, I put this heavier weight oil in there and the oil pressure number goes up, but it's a placebo effect. You feel better because you think there's more oil pressure, but in reality, you just put thicker oil in there. You didn't change anything about how the system works. So that's myth number three. Myth number four, high volume is the same thing as high pressure when it comes to oil pumps. This is absolutely not true. This is more of a clarification for a lot of people who tend to get these two terms confused with each other. And I just want to make sure it's crystal clear what the difference is between high volume and high pressure. To explain more clearly the difference between the two, on our left here we have a high volume pump. Now you'll notice that the oil pressure release spring is at 65 psi. However, because it is a high volume pump, we're going to be forcing more of that oil through the system. Even at idle, we're going to start a little bit higher than a stock pump would. And then as RPM builds, we're going to go up to the 65 psi, and then it'll basically just flatline across there. Now, by contrast, a high pressure pump over here, it's the same volume as a standard pump is, so it's actually going to be generating less oil pressure down here at idle, which is the opposite of what we're actually looking for. But because it has a higher release spring in it, it'll generate more pressure over time. It'll go all the way up to 75 psi, and my pen's not working. It'll go all the way up to 75 psi and then taper off from there, which is great. It's nice to have a little bit of extra oil pressure here up top, but we don't actually need that. That's not important. We're making plenty of oil pressure over here with the factory release spring. That was never our concern. Our concern was with the idle oil pressure. Well, again, I should say, to clarify, our idle oil flow. The pressure is just a byproduct of that. So you can see the difference. A high pressure pump does not give us what we're actually looking for. The high volume pump does. Our last myth, myth number 5, the high volume oil pump is a fix. Now I say this is a myth because This is simply a preventative measure. It's something we can do to help the situation. The pump absolutely will not correct a vehicle that is already experiencing lifter failure or anything like that. This is just a preventative measure. It's something I feel like can help these vehicles to perform long term. All right, classroom session is over. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of actually installing this pump and the MDS delete system. First thing we're gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect the battery. Then I'm going to take the intake air box out along with this intake tube here. I'm gonna pull this upper panel here and pull the grill shell off just to give us some more access to the front area. Now the air box itself, it just lifts out of here. There's no actual fasteners that hold it in place. Just like that. This upper panel here is just held in place with a series of Christmas tree style clips. So a little trim tool here and pop these guys out. This guy comes right off. Now note that if you guys are just installing the pump alone on your vehicle, you won't have to actually remove the radiator or anything like that from the vehicle. Because I am doing the MDS delete and I'm replacing that camshaft, I need that room to actually get the cam out of the engine, so I will need to remove the radiator. You certainly will not have to remove the grill or anything like that. I'm doing that in my case because I want to be able to video right through the core support to show you guys more clearly what it is that I'm doing instead of trying to shove the camera down over the top. So just recognize that if you are doing this job, you won't have to do that part of it. If you are just doing a pump install, you do not have to discharge your AC system. What you can do is you can just unbolt the AC compressor and lay it to the side. It is a little bit of a pain in the butt because these lines are constantly in your way. So if possible, I do recommend that you discharge the AC so you can just remove these lines. It makes things a lot easier to work in the engine bay, but it's not a necessary process. Now is a good time to go ahead and drain your radiator. There is a petcock down here at the very bottom of the radiator. Tough to see down in there. There we go. That guy right in the dead center right there. You unscrew that. Don't take it all the way out. Just unscrew it until it starts pouring coolant out of there and drain that radiator. Next up, we're going to remove the upper radiator hose and then the cooling fan. Now to do that, we're going to use this special tool that is this air hammer, and it has a special attachment that'll actually hook onto the nut for the fan and go and knock it free. Now, I absolutely love that tool. It's one of my favorite tools that I have. You do not have to have these specialized tools. There are wrenches that you can buy that will do the same thing. They're still a big pain in the butt. Having a specialized tool like this makes it so much easier. So again, I will put that link both here and in the description down below. All right, I've already removed the AC lines here, so hopefully give you guys a better view of what's happening here. I got our tool on here. Now this is a left-hand thread, so we want to go ahead and knock it clockwise to actually loosen it. I'll tell you, just getting the fan loose can be one of the most frustrating parts of the entire job. So just kind of keep your cool until you finally get that thing to pop free. And then what you'll do is you'll basically just spin it free. And it'll just kind of sit down in there. And what we're going to do is next we're going to remove the actual shroud itself, and that'll allow that fan to drop out of there. Now, an important note about these viscous fan clutches is that you don't want to leave them lying flat. You want to keep them upright because that viscous fluid in there can drain into different portions, and apparently it can cause it not to work correctly anymore. So you don't want to ruin your fan clutch. So just store it in an upright position before you go to reinstall it. Sometimes I have people on my videos saying, well, of course it's easy for you. You've got the lift there. And I always tell people that the lift does not change the amount of work that's involved. It's still the exact same amount of work. What the lift does is it's easier on your body. And it seems as how I just had 2 discs replaced in my neck last year. I make no apologies for using a lift now. Okay, from underneath here, there's a couple of different things we need to do. There's a couple of push pins, one here, and one here that we need to disconnect. And then this lower part of the shroud here will disconnect from the main part. There's a couple of clips here and here. Just use a little pry tool to force that forward, and then this whole entire section here will leverage out and down. That way we can get the whole shroud out of there along with our viscous fan. Now, I did things in this order because that's how I'm used to doing it. However, you could just as easily do it the other way around. What I mean by that is that lower panel that pops off the shroud, after you take that off, that allows you to pull the upper shroud without actually removing the viscous fan first. So then you have more access to the fan afterwards. Now, for my sake, again, I'm just used to doing it the other way, so that's the way I did it. But for you guys, it probably makes more sense to go ahead and pull the shroud first and then remove the viscous fan. Now we've got that radiator out of here and all those coolers, you'll be able to see very clearly exactly what it is that we're doing. Again, if you're not doing the MDS delete, if you're just doing the pump, you won't need to actually take all this stuff out of there. I'm mostly doing it for visual purposes. Now we're gonna go ahead and try to get our timing cover off of here. So we're gonna take off the serpentine belt, we're gonna take off the idler pulley, the alternator, the tensioner, the AC compressor, and our crank pulley. Let's get into it. Note that when you're removing the AC compressor, if you are just leaving the system charged and you're kind of laying it to the side so you can get the timing cover off, there is actually a stud right here that holds it to the timing cover rather than just a bolt. So you'll have to actually remove this stud. So the way to do that, this is an E-torx end on there. So you'll have to use the E-torx to unscrew the stud from the timing cover, and then you can just lay that AC compressor to the side. Our next step is to pull the crank pulley off of there. Now this is where we need another one of our special tools. Unfortunately, a regular 3-jaw puller will not work on the Hemi engines. There's just not a whole lot of room in there to come and grab it. So there are specific pullers meant for the Hemi engine. Again, I will link it both here and in the description down below. Now we can remove the timing cover itself. Now there are a series of bolts. They're on the outer edge of the actual timing cover itself. And there's also 5 bolts that hold it from the underside that go from the oil pan up into the timing cover. So don't forget those. Now, an important thing to remember though is that you do not have to actually remove the water pump here from the timing cover. You can take it with the timing cover, which is nice because then you don't have to replace the gasket or the seal for the water pump. So in order to do that, basically you're going to do this top bolt here, and then every second bolt is the one that goes through into the block itself. So you go this one, this one, this one, and so on around the perimeter there, and then the whole timing cover comes off with the water pump still attached. A couple of things I want to bring to your attention here. You will have some longer bolts right here, and this one's a 15 millimeter, and this one is also very long as well. All the rest of them are going to be 13 millimeter, and they are significantly shorter in length. So keep an eye on which ones go where. That way, when you put it back together again, you won't have any confusion. And also, there is a tie strap here that connects from the cylinder head to the timing cover. You'll have to unbolt this little tie bar as well. Once you've got all the bolts out of here, you can use a little bit of a pry bar action to kind of pry it away a little bit. It'll be stuck pretty good, especially on the bottom edge. However, this thing should move fairly freely. If it's taking you a ton of effort to move the timing cover, then you probably don't have all the bolts out. It's mostly hitting my bucket. This one's actually coming off very nicely. There we go. Timing cover out. And there it is. Here is your oil pump all exposed and ready to be swapped out. And you might think to yourself, well, that wasn't so bad, except for one thing. Now, if this were a Charger, a Challenger, or a 300, this is as far as we would need to go, because basically all you have to do to change the pump at this point is remove those 4 bolts that hold the pump on in the front. You can then swivel the pump enough to access the oil pickup tube and get that bolt out of there. It's still a little tight, but you can easily do it. And then the pickup tube just lays there in the oil pan, put a new pump on, put everything all back together again. Unfortunately, because of the truck's rear sump design, the oil pickup tube runs across the bottom of the engine and is bolted in 2 different places. What this means is that we actually have to remove the oil pan to do the oil pump on these trucks. Now, I have had a couple of people contact me and say, hey, if you just bend the lip of the oil pan down far enough, you can access that bolt and swap it out. And while that's probably true, that's just a little bit too sketchy for me. I'm here trying to show you guys the correct way to do this job, so that's what we're going to do. I do want to point out as well that if you have a SRT Charger Challenger, you will also have to pull the oil pan off of there, because that pickup tube is held in 2 different places, so you still have to pull the pan on those types of vehicles. Okay. Pulling the pan on this thing, it's not super fun. You do actually have to lower the front differential down a little bit on the 4-wheel drive models to gain enough clearance to get that pan out of there. But I don't think it's especially that much more work, so let's get into it. Okay, first step, we're gonna remove this little plate right here. There are 2 bolts that go up, and then there's this one, this one, this one, and then this one, and 2 bolts that go up again to get this plate out of here. Next thing we wanna do is get this lower cross member out of the way. There's just these 2 bolts here, 2 bolts here, and this thing will drop right out the way. Next step, we're gonna take out all the bolts that are actually holding this front differential in place. We're not gonna drop the whole thing out of the vehicle. We just wanna let it droop down far enough out of the way so we can get this oil pan out. All right, we've got our front differential lowered out of the way. You can see just how much that drops it down, and really gives us, it's kind of hard to tell from here, but it really does give us a lot more room to get this pan out of here. So feel pretty confident about that. Service information says we also need to raise the engine to actually get this out of here. So hopefully just lowering this will be enough. We'll see if we can't wiggle this thing out of here. I do feel like I need to warn you guys that all of the bolts that they use to actually hold this front differential in place, they use all of the Loctite on them. So they're all very, very tight. So kind of tight squeeze, get those things out of there. Just stay patient, you'll get them. Something else I always mention when doing this kind of a job, I will wait to drain the oil until after you pull that front timing cover off. The reason is because a lot of that coolant will then pour down into the oil pan. And if you've already drained the oil, that coolant can kind of hide in different areas. But as it is right now, the coolant will have dropped below the level of the oil itself. So once I pull this drain plug, the oil will force all of that coolant out. So you'll be left with nothing but oil in the oil pan. Now, not a big deal in this case because we are actually removing the oil pan entirely. I could go ahead and clean that. But as a general rule, if I'm pulling a timing cover, I will wait to drain the oil until after I've done that. There we go. Not very much in there, but still good practice. Okay, I just got all of the fasteners out of the oil pan. The only thing you need to realize here is that there's a lot of bolts and there's a couple of studs. The studs are important because that's where some of your wiring clips onto. So make note of where the studs are located in the pan before you take them out. There we go. Will we get lucky and be able to snake this thing out of here? That is the question. Ooh, it's gonna be close. I don't know if we're gonna get so lucky. We may end up having to raise the engine a little bit. Oh, oh. Hey, all right. Okay, now you can clearly see our bolt that we need to remove for the oil pickup tube. I will warn you that as soon as you break this free, there's a bunch of trapped oil inside this tube that's gonna drain absolutely everywhere, so be prepared for that. Okay, after all that, all we have to do now is take off these 4 13mm bolts, and this pump pops right off, and we can put our new one right into place. Now, externally, you'd be hard-pressed to notice a difference between these two pumps. How are you supposed to know whether this one's a high-volume pump or not? Well, even though externally they look the same, internally is where they differ. Now, the factory pump here has a 14mm wide rotor, a little gear rotor that spins in there. This one, the high-volume one, has a 16mm wide rotor. That's the same as the Hellcat pumps have. That's what gives it that same capacity, and that means that externally the dimensions can be identical, and therefore it's a direct swap onto a 5.7 or a 6.4 engine. Now, if you are just installing the pump on your vehicle, good news, this is as far as you need to go. Now you can just start the reassembly process. A quick note on that pump there, there's no gasket or seal that goes between the pump and the block, so go ahead and just bolt it directly right back up. When you're putting the pickup tube back in, I highly recommend installing a new pickup tube O-ring. And also make sure that when you're doing that, you're oiling up that new O-ring so that it doesn't get cut or pinched. It's far too simple for that to happen to overlook this easy step. Just make sure it's nicely lubed up so it bolts up properly and you don't have any issues. I have heard from a few people who have done this high volume pump install and then their oil pressure is actually less than when they started because they ended up pinching that O-ring. So definitely be careful about that. However, for us, we're going to go ahead and continue on with the MDS delete, which means I need to go ahead and get these cylinder heads off because we've got to get those MDS lifters out of there. Now, I'm sure there's some of you out there who are asking me right now, well, if you're so adamant that the MDS system is not actually causing these lifter failures, why are you deleting it on your vehicle? Well, there's three different reasons why I'm doing it on this vehicle. Number one is that I just don't find that system as effective mile per gallon wise on the Ram trucks. On the cars, I actually think it works really well. You get quite a bit more mile per gallon. The trucks, I don't know if it's a gearing ratio thing or just possibly the way I drive, but it's constantly moving in and out of the system instead of staying in it. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I live in a pretty mountainous area, so I'm constantly going up hills, down hills, so the system is just turning on, turning off, turning on, turning off. So I just don't think it's as effective. Like I said, if you have a Charger Challenger 300, I think it's advantageous to stay with that system because it does help quite a bit mile per gallon wise. Now, the second reason why I'm deleting it is because I am going to go with some more aggressive performance modifications with this truck in the future, and I would have had to have deleted the MDS at that time, so may as well just get it knocked out right now. But the third reason I'm deleting it is actually the most important, and that is once I get these cylinder heads off, I'm going to be showing you guys those oil passageways that directly feed the lifter bores, and when you remove the MDS solenoids, then you have full oil flow, full pressurized oil flow to the lifters at all times while the engine is running. That is the maximum way we can protect these engines as much as possible. So that's why I'm deleting MDS on this vehicle. Now this might sound kind of funny, but we're honestly not that far away from having these cylinder heads off and having that cam out. The great thing about these Hemi engines is that from the top side, they're a very simple engine, not a whole lot happening there. So this can be pretty quick to get those off. One important note here is that the exhaust manifolds, or in this case our shorty headers, they will stay attached to the cylinder heads both while removing and installing them. On any Gen-3 Hemi out there, it's by far easier to just pull the cylinder heads with the manifolds attached than to go ahead and unbolt those things and rebolt them up. That's just a pain. We don't do that. But for right now, our first thing we need to do is go ahead and get this intake manifold pulled off of here. The only thing you need to know about this that's a little bit tricky is that on the back side of the manifold, there's what's called the SRV actuator, a short runner valve actuator. That connector that attaches to it has a very short lead on it. And if you have the intake manifold unbolted and you kind of like yank it forward, it's very easy to break that actuator. You don't want to do that. It costs quite a bit of money. So just pull the manifold forward just a little bit and then reach back there and unclip that connector. It's tricky to get through. I'll show it to you guys after I have it off so you have an idea of what you're looking at. But yeah, make sure you do that. Otherwise you could cost yourself some money. So right back here on the back of the manifold, let me see if I can sneak back there. There's a connector right there. You need to go ahead and disconnect that before you can actually remove the intake manifold itself. Here's what the plug looks like from the back side right there. And keep in mind there is a safety lock on it, one of those red tabs that you got to pull down first before you can actually disconnect it. Okay, now that our intake manifold is removed, we have access to our MDS solenoids right here. There's 4 of them in there. We need to go ahead and remove those solenoids and replace them with the block-off plug. So first things first, we'll get this little silencer pad out of here. It's glued in place, so you'll just have to kind of tear it off. It's your choice whether or not to reuse it. I honestly can't tell a difference sound-wise if you do or don't have that in there, so totally up to you. Okay, this next tip I have for you is probably the biggest one of the whole entire job, and that's removing these MDS solenoids. Now, they just have a little 10mm bolt that holds them down, but if you take that bolt out and then you go, man, these things are really stuck in here, and you start prying on them and you're trying to get them out of there, and boop, the top half will pop off, and then the bottom is stuck down in the block, and they are a pain to get what's left out of there. So, total nightmare. You don't want to do that. Why am I holding a hammer? Well, it's because this is actually directly from Chrysler to essentially give these things a wrap right on the top. Just pop, just like that. And that will actually break the seal around the O-rings, and then you can generally swivel these things and they'll pop right out. So make sure you're doing that before you try to pull these solenoids out. Otherwise, they're just going to break in half and you'll have a bad day. Success, we're 4 for 4 getting those solenoids out. Now we're going to install our block off plugs here. As with anything else that has an O-ring, make sure you're lubing it up with some fresh clean oil before you're putting it in, because if you pinch or cut one of these O-rings, these are pressurized oil passageways, and it's just going to fill up that intake valley with oil and just pour out the back. You're going to have a serious mess, and you have to take the intake all back off. Something I just noticed is that Melling is actually providing these with the OEM plugs. So this is actually a Mopar part that comes in this kit, which is pretty cool. These are the plugs that are installed on manual transmission vehicles that don't come with MDS. Okay, there we go. The new plugs have been installed. Now, for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and leave this sub harness in here because we are still controlling the VVT. Now, when I switch this to a more aggressive camshaft later, basically we'll be locking out the VVT. We can get rid of this entire harness. You can see it actually connects right here, so you can delete this whole thing if you want. But for right now, like I said, we're going to keep that in place. Okay. Next step here is to get our coils off, valve covers off. We're going to go ahead and take off our rocker arms. Then we'll unbolt these cylinder heads, get those things popped off, get those lifters out of here. Should be pretty straightforward. All right, we're back for day number 2 here. Now, if you guys are planning on doing this job yourself, if you are doing the pump and the MDS delete, plan on at least 2 days, if not 3, kind of depending upon your experience level. Now, last clip you saw, we got the cylinder heads off. I've kind of had them just draining over here. We're gonna get this surface cleaned off, ready for the new gaskets. But first, I wanna go ahead and get those lifters pulled out of the engine itself, give you guys a closer look at those and what we're replacing them with. If you haven't seen them before, these are your lifters right here, these couple of banks right there. There's a single 8mm bolt in the center of each. As soon as you undo that, the yokes will kind of release from there and you can actually pull the lifters out from the block itself. We've got all the lifters pulled out from the engine, and as I suspected, I don't see any obvious signs of failure. There's a lot of wear on them, no question about it, but no actual lifter failure. Now, when I'm speaking about lifter failure, I'm specifically speaking about these little needle roller bearings here are failing, and then the roller lobe itself will basically stop spinning, it'll become flat, and it'll just start hammering away at the cam lobe itself. I talked more about this in other videos, so you can go into detail on that, but that's essentially what we're talking about with lifter failure. Now, I want to get you in here close because I want to dispel another myth about these lifters. Now, when looking at these lifters here, the ones on the left here are your non-MDS lifters. These ones over here on the right with the holes, those are the MDS ones. Now, essentially what's happening here is there's little pins inside these holes, and when oil pressure is applied to those passageways, those pins will depress, these lifters will collapse, and then it no longer actuates the valves on those cylinders. That's how it's actually deactivating it to just 4 cylinders. Now, very often when people replace these lifters, they'll send me a message and say, hey, I know this lifter has failed because if you look, you can see the pin very clearly in that hole, but in this hole, there's no pin, so it must have spun, so this is a bad lifter. And I'm here to tell you in no uncertain terms that there is nothing wrong with this lifter at all. It may look a little bit weird if the pins aren't lining up in there perfectly, but it helps to understand exactly how this thing works, because that inner cylinder that houses those pins, when the lifter is collapsed, it's spinning in a circle. And when the lifter is commanded essentially to open back up again, only one of those pins needs to at least partially lock into place for the lifter to remain functional. So basically almost every single MDS lifter I take apart has a pin that is not lined up perfectly. Doesn't matter, its operation is still good. There's nothing wrong with that lifter whatsoever. So don't be distracted by the fact that these pins aren't lining up perfectly on the MDS lifters. I realized while editing this video that I never got a good shot for you guys of those oil passageways. So here is some clips from some previous videos I've done, really showing you guys how basically where the MDS solenoids connect from the top of the block, you can see how those connect in with these specific oil passageways that feed those lifter bores. So you can clearly see how this system applies pressurized oil to those lifters. Now that the lifters are out of the engine, the last item to come out is the camshaft, so we actually need to time the engine first before we pull that cam out. Let's get started. Now generally, I like to time the engine before I actually remove the old camshaft. The reason for that is because now you know that your crankshaft is in the correct position and you don't have to mess with it after that. Now realistically, in this scenario, it's not that important because with the oil pump removed, you can actually see the timing mark on the crank gear, so no matter what, you could handle the timing. But in other scenarios, you oftentimes will not have the oil pump removed and you cannot see that lower timing mark at all. So if you time the engine first, then you know that your crank is in time and you don't have to worry about it after that. One of the nice things here is that this is our #1 cylinder and we know that our #1 piston will be at top dead center when this thing's in time. So you kind of want to look for 2 things here. #1 is that this piston will be in the full up position, but also on the crank sprocket, or sorry, the camshaft sprocket, there's going to be a vertical line embossed in that sprocket. And when that vertical line is exactly 12 o'clock, that's when you are in time. So let's go ahead and get this thing lined up and I'll show you that mark. Okay, easy enough. Let me see if I can get you to see that. There you go. See that vertical line right there? We are directly at the 12 o'clock position. And our #1 piston is at TDC. So we know that this thing is in time. Next thing we want to do here is go ahead and pin this tensioner back. Now this is just spring loaded, so it's very easy just to push it back. There's a hole right here that once we push it back, it'll line up with this hole and we can stick a pin through there and pin this tensioner in place. And then we can actually remove the tensioner entirely. There we go. Next, we'll be removing the cam sprocket gear. And finally, we have the cam thrust plate here. Now, these are T30 Torques that are countersunk in here. You pull out these 4 bolts, this plate pops off, and the cam will just slide right on out of there. Now I've made this special tool to help pull this camshaft out. You don't need anything like this. Generally, I'll just take the cam sprocket bolt, kind of stick it in there a little bit, and you can leverage enough off of that to actually get the cam to come out. When you are coming out, try to be careful. Obviously, you're gonna be touching the cam bearings in there. Don't wanna be slamming it into those bearings as you come out, but also, you know, just be slow and gentle with it. You'll be fine. And there it is, camshaft out. All right, you guys, come take a look at this. I found something that I think is very interesting and I think you guys should see. So it's been my contention for a number of years now that I don't believe the problem is actually even with the lifters themselves. I think it's an issue with the camshaft hardening of the lobes, because it seems like the lobes are failing first, and that's what's causing the lifter roller to fail. So take a close look here. Now again, this truck has, I believe, 85,000 miles on it essentially at this point. Take a look at these cam lobes. Look at the wear you're seeing right on the face of them. I'm trying to get a better shot here. So definitely seeing quite a bit of wear there on the lobes. Not crazy though, right? But look here at cylinder number 7. See the pitting? Look at that pitting that's happening there to that cam lobe. And that's happening as well on cylinder number 6. Not as bad, but definitely still there. But absolutely fascinating. Again, this is just furthering my thought that it's the cam that's the problem, not the lifters. Because in my case, the lifters had not actually failed yet. Yes, they showed a lot of wear, but there was no play in those needle bearings. They were not jumping up and down, flattening, nothing like that. But you can clearly see the cam is starting to go first. All right, I've got the new Melling cam all lubed up with some engine assembly lube. Let's get it stuck in there. There we go. Now, as a reference, the dowel pin in the end of the camshaft here needs to be at the 12 o'clock position. All right, let's talk about making sure your timing is correct as you're going back together again. The great thing is that the Hemi engine is a very, very simple engine to time. There's only 2 things you need to worry about: that the crank timing gear is at the 6 o'clock position, and that the cam sprocket mark is at the 12 o'clock position, directly opposite from each other. That's literally it. Now, the timing chain on these engines does actually have a couple of marks on it to help you actually line everything up. But I'll say this, that the marks in the chain are largely irrelevant. You don't have to line those up if you want. All that matters is that cam mark and the crank mark. However, just for you guys, I went ahead and lined up the marks in the chain, so I'll show you those now. The one on the crank can be very difficult to see. There's just a really small dot there. I think you can see it, and there's a single line on the chain that follows that mark. In contrast, on the cam mark, you can see that vertical line on the cam sprocket. It's actually bracketed on either side by the marks on the chain itself. So now we know for a fact that our cam sprocket is in time and our crank sprocket is in time. This engine's in time. So I went ahead and put the tensioner back in there. All I have to do is pull out the pin that we put in there. There we go. Now it is tension. Now the last thing I need to do is go ahead and torque down the cam sprocket bolt. One of the most common questions I get is, how do I hold the engine in place so I can torque down that cam sprocket bolt without the engine turning over? Well, it's pretty simple. Basically, you just gain access to your flex plate right here and stick a screwdriver or something in there to keep the flex plate from rotating while you're torquing that bolt down. Just don't forget to actually pull that screwdriver back out. Now, after you got your cam sprocket bolt there torqued properly, go ahead and spin the engine over a couple of times until that cam sprocket mark is once again at the 12 o'clock position, and then verify that your number 1 piston is at top dead center once again. If you do that, you can basically be assured that you are in time. All right, let's take a closer look at our new Johnson lifters versus the factory ones. As you would expect, these are very, very nice quality lifters, very well put together. Interestingly, the actual roller area is narrower on the Johnson lifter versus the factory one. It's kind of an interesting point there. Not exactly sure why that is, but still, very nice piece. One thing I will mention is that these are completely dry, whereas the factory ones, when you receive new ones, they are kind of pre-oiled to some extent. So these ones, I probably will be dumping them in some oil first to let them sit. No matter what, I guarantee you that the lifters are going to rattle on first startup, so don't let that freak you out. They'll rattle pretty severely for the first few seconds, then they'll quiet down as soon as that pressurized oil really starts to pump them up. One other piece of advice here, and I cannot stress this enough, please, please, please Do not buy cheap lifters from either Amazon or eBay. Yes, I know either the OEM lifters or these Johnson lifters probably are not the cheapest thing in the world, but you guys see how much work is involved with doing this job. Please do not put those cheap lifters in there. I have heard countless stories of people who say, man, I put these new lifters in and they rattle and they tick worse than the factory ones ever did, and they're brand new. And that's just something we see with a lot of these aftermarket ones. They're just extraordinarily cheaply made, and they will rattle pretty good, and they'll tick, and they'll drive you up a wall. So please do not go cheap on the lifters. There's other areas where you can kind of cheap out a little bit. Don't do it on the lifters. Another important thing to note here is that if you are changing out your system to non-MDS lifters, you will have to buy new yokes that are non-MDS only. The reason for that is because the MDS lifters themselves have a wider base than the non-MDS ones do. So you can see that this lifter is nice and tight inside this yoke here. But if we take this non-MDS one and put it in the MDS side, it's not tight at all, and it just kind of rattles all over the place. So that doesn't work. We have to replace it with these non-MDS style yokes. So fortunately, the Melling kit does come with the new ones. Now, another thing that people are asking me all the time is how am I cleaning the surface of the cylinder head and of the block to get it ready for reassembly? Well, it's very simple. I'm basically using this little angle die grinder, and I use a red roll-lock disc on it. Now, a lot of people think, they're like, oh man, that's crazy. Like you're so aggressive. You're grinding grooves in this thing. I don't know what kind of Neanderthal you think I might be, but that's not how this works. With the red roll-lock disc, you want to make sure to keep it flat to the surface, and you're not applying any pressure. You're just letting the disc do the work, and all you're doing is taking off that gasket residue here. You're not trying to get all the marks out of it, anything like that. You don't want to be up on the edge grinding away like that. No, we're just being very simple. We're being very safe, and we're just cleaning the gasket residue. That's all. Yes, it will make a nice even surface here. I have never had even one problem with the cylinder head over the years that I've been doing it this way. Other people are more sensitive, and they want to sit there for 40 hours with a plastic scraper getting every last little mark and everything. That's fine. You guys do it however you want to do it. You ask me how I do it, that's exactly how I do it, and I've been very successful with it. Okay, giving you guys a closer shot here of what the surface looks like once I'm all done. Now, if you'll notice here, if I get in close, kind of tough to see, but you can see there's still some marks right there. You can kind of see the outline here. This is where you'll get yourself into trouble if you're trying to get all of that out. That's a little bit of electrolysis happening here. It's eaten into the surface of the cylinder head. That's not a problem. It won't affect the way that this seals whatsoever at all. It's very, very minor markings. Again, all we were doing here is getting rid of that gasket residue. Now we have a nice, clean, even surface for the new head gasket to seal to properly. This cylinder head's ready to go back on. Another question I get asked all the time is, because I have the cylinder heads off the vehicle, shouldn't I go ahead and send these out to machine shop so I can do a little skim on the surface here, make sure it's nice and flat? And my answer to that is, unless you have reason to suspect that the cylinder head is warped or not flat in some way, it's generally not necessary. Now, of course, certainly nothing wrong with that. If you decide to do that, absolutely more power to you. But in my experience, there's generally not cause to do that. However, if you want to check this for yourself at home, there's an easy way to do it. You get this super technical tool called a straight edge. And what it is a machine surface on one end of it. And you'll basically lay it across the cylinder head surface here and check it at various points. Now, the specification on this is 2/1000ths. So essentially, you get some feeler gauges here with a 2/1000th feeler bit here. And you'll lay it across and then measure it at certain areas. See if that feeler gauge can fit underneath the straight edge and the surface of the cylinder head. If it does, then you do have some warpage going on there, and it makes sense to send it off to a machine shop. Now, importantly, make sure that your cylinder head surface is clean before you're doing this test, because obviously these bits of carbon here and the gasket residue can throw off your readings. 2/1000ths is not very much. So make sure you clean all that first, and then you can check it. And my recommendation is, when you're using the straight edge, you want to check it at multiple points and various spots. That way you can get a really accurate reading all the way across. Another thing I like to do is I will use a flashlight. So essentially, if you hold the straight edge here, Use your flashlight, shine it behind the straight edge, see if you can see light coming through the other side. That's a good indicator that there might be a gap there. However, as mentioned, the vast majority of times when I've done the checks on these cylinder heads, they turn out just fine and there's no problem with just reinstalling them. With the block, it's an even easier process because it is an iron block, so there's pretty much no way you could harm it using one of those red roll-lock discs. You can be slightly more aggressive with that, but you don't really need to. Again, we're just taking off that residue. Now, I just want to show you guys just how nice of a surface finish that roll-lock disc gives to the block. Really nice, even smooth finish. We got rid of all that residue. Now, in the same situation, there are going to be some marks in the block itself that are due to electrolysis. You're not going to get all of those out. Do not worry. These will still seal just fine. So we're ready to get those head gaskets on there and get the cylinder heads reinstalled. Something you do need to pay attention to when you're putting these new cylinder head gaskets on there is that they are in fact labeled left and right, and there should be a top and a bottom as well. The only thing you really need to think about is that when you do actually put this down onto the block, just make sure all of these holes are lining up with each other. As long as they're all lining up with each other, chances are pretty good you've got it in the right spot. The other thing I want to mention here, these lower holes where the head bolts actually go through, find some way to clean those out. When you pull the heads off, both coolant and oil like to drain down into those holes, and you don't want to leave that in there because then you'll get inaccurate torque readings when you're trying to torque your bolts down. So find a way to clean that out, whether it be compressed air or a suction device of some kind. Okay, it's finally time to talk about the thing that I get the most pushback on of all of my videos, and I really don't know why, because I'm actually trying to save you guys money. People ask me all the time, are these head bolts reusable? And the answer is yes, they are reusable. This is straight from Chrysler. There is no issue with reusing these bolts. I think the issue is more one of terminology. People are getting these terms confused. Now, if you have a bolt like the LS's used that are called torque to yield, then that means that the bolt is physically stretching as you torque it down, and it's a one-time use bolt and you can't ever use it again once it is loosened, okay? That is a torque to yield bolt. These bolts, the way you fasten them is called torque to angle. And I think people are getting those terms confused. That doesn't mean that this is a torque to yield bolt. That's just a different strategy to achieve your final torque number. I hopefully can explain it this way. Just recently, I was working on a 3.6 Pentastar engine and I was replacing the cam phasers on it. And when I was bolting those cam phasers back on for the exhaust phaser, it told me to torque it to 118 foot-pounds. So boom, use a torque wrench, 118 foot-pounds, no problem. But for the intake phaser, it told me to torque it down to 45 foot-pounds and then do an additional 95 degrees from there. Want to take any guesses as to what that final torque number ended up being? You guessed it, 118 foot-pounds. So I'm not sure why they had a different strategy for that, but torque to angle, that's all that means. It's a different way of achieving your final torque number. It has nothing to do with the actual bolt itself. So these head bolts are 100% reusable. I've done it a million times with no problems whatsoever. The only thing that Chrysler says is that same thing we would say for any kind of a bolt, where basically look at the threads of the bolt, see if you can see any signs of it being stretched or necked down, then replace it. In all the years I've been doing this, I have never once seen a Hemi cylinder head bolt that was unusable from being stretched too far. Also, one last note regarding these Hemi cylinder heads. A lot of times people will ask me, do I need to pre-lube these things before putting them down in the block? And the answer is no. Chrysler wants you to install these things dry because, again, if you're putting some oil in there, you're going to be affecting your overall torque number. A couple more points I want to share with you guys when we're putting these cylinder heads back on. Number one, I like to just run the cylinder head bolts down until they just start to tighten, and then I start the torque process from there. These bolts should spin in very easily and then come to a hard stop as soon as the bolt starts to tighten. If you're running that bolt in and then all of a sudden it gets hard and it's like turning slowly and it's hard to turn, stop right there. You've either got something cockeyed or potentially you could even have part of the harness stuck under the cylinder head or something like that. And if you just keep cranking it down, hoping it'll pull itself flat, there's a chance you could damage something like that wiring harness. So you don't want to do that. Okay, as far as the torque process on these things, for those main cylinder head bolts, those 10 bolts, you want to torque it to 25 foot-pounds in the first round, 40 foot-pounds on the next round, and then 90 degrees after that. So if you do not have a torque to angle torque wrench, I will go ahead and link one of those both here and down below. But if you don't want to go that far, if you have a regular torque wrench, what you can do is you can mark each bolt with a paint pen and then just go 90 degrees from there, totally fine. In my experience, generally after you perform this torque procedure, you'll end up at around 95 foot-pounds on these things. So that's a good reference point if you don't have a torque to angle torque wrench. Now the upper bolts that go along the top side of the cylinder head, those will be first torqued to 15 foot-pounds and then final torqued at 25 foot-pounds. Now we come to the point where we're installing our push rods. Now this Melling kit comes with new push rods. The short ones are for the intake and the long ones are for the exhaust. Now I wanted to take a moment to talk to you guys about this because the push rods are, ironically enough, an area where I see the most problems that people have. This is what will trip people up the most. It seems easy enough, right? You just stick the push rod down the tube, put on your rocker arms, and you're good to go. But like I said, this is an area that really trips people up, primarily because when you're running that push rod down the push rod tube, you really need to be careful and make sure that the back of the push rod here is actually going into the back of the lifter. It's actually very easy to run it slightly to the side of the lifter or just not square it up in there, and that's where a lot of these problems come from. So really, after you get the push rods in, use a flashlight or a mirror, whatever you need to do to really kind of get down in there and make sure that this is in the back of the lifter. One of the easy ways to tell if you're in the lifter is that when you slide this push rod down there, push on the end of the push rod, and if you feel the lifter slide forward in the bore, then you know that you're in the back of the lifter. Unfortunately, this doesn't always work because depending upon where the cam lobe is, when you push on the back of this, maybe the lifter doesn't move at all because it's maybe on the pointy end of the lobe down here. But for the most part, if you feel this push rod move with the lifter, you're good to go as far as that goes. But again, double check it with the flashlight. That is problem number one. Problem number two is the number one issue I see when people do this job. There is no question, 95% of the problems I see are because of this issue. Now, what happens is people will finish the job, they'll put everything back together again, they'll fire the vehicle up, and all of a sudden it's running like garbage. It won't run unless they keep their foot on the gas, and then as soon as they let out the gas, it immediately stalls. And their first thought in their head is, I screwed up the timing on this thing, because it very much does sound like the timing is wrong. However, before you go down that rabbit hole and think, oh man, it's the timing and I have to pull the front cover off and all this stuff, I can almost guarantee you that your issue is in fact an intake push rod. And the reason I say that is because it's very easy to not get these push rods seated correctly in the rocker arm itself. I'll show you this a little bit more clearly as we install them. But when you're putting these things on, it's just super hard to get them seated correctly in there. And what happens is the rocker arm will go, or the push rod will go pop and pop out of one of those rocker arms, and then it's no longer actuating the intake valve, and the vehicle runs like absolute garbage. So it's a little bit simpler in that you just have to pull the valve covers back off to inspect and find out which one of these popped out. But a better solution is just to make sure you do it right the first time. And to do that, you want to put those rockers on, and then what you'll do is you'll kind of feel around the back side of the rocker arm itself and make sure that this is fully seated in the cup. And then after you do that step, go ahead and roll the engine over at least 3 or 4 times. Make sure that all those intake valves are actuating properly before you put the valve covers on. That's a really good extra step to help make sure that you don't fall into this trap. But I want you guys to know, if you do this job and you fire the thing up and it's running terrible, that is the very first thing I would check. Don't go towards timing. Okay, I just want to give you guys a clear look. Now this is where the intake push rods go through. You can see the hole right down there. And then this is where the exhaust push rods go through. So make sure you're going down those exact holes. Now the exhaust push rods are actually very, very simple to verify that they actually are fully in the cup here, because you can actually see it and feel it. So the exhaust ones aren't really a big deal. It's the intake ones that are the issue. Now when you're installing the rocker arms themselves, you'll notice it'll be very hard to get it to suck down evenly because each piston is at a different point in its cycle. So some of the valve springs are going to be compressed and some of them are not. So it's going to want to tighten down something like that. So just go slow, tighten down each bolt a half a turn at a time. Try to suck the thing down as evenly as you possibly can. When it comes to the final torque spec, this is something I find very interesting because up to 2011, the torque spec was 16 foot-pounds. And then in 2012, they changed the final torque value, which makes zero sense whatsoever because 2011 to 2012, nothing changed on the engine whatsoever. It's the exact same engine. But the new torque spec is 17 foot-pounds and then an additional 30 degrees. Now, if I had to guess, I would imagine that final torque value would come in somewhere around 25 foot-pounds. That's just a guess. A couple of last things I want to mention here about the rocker arms. It is impossible to actually get the rocker arms confused because these ones have the little embossed eye in them for intake, so don't worry about getting those mixed up. And the other thing people ask me is they say, hey, is it normal for these rocker arms to move back and forth after you get them installed, like this? And the answer is yes. When that cylinder is on the base circle of the camshaft and there's no pressure on that rocker, it does have the ability to move back and forth. However, while the engine is running, that will actually center up and it won't be doing that back and forth action. Another important tip I have for you is that when you're reinstalling the valve covers here, it's very kind of tricky to get it over the back rocker stands here. And in the process of wiggling it on there, what you can do is you can actually pull the gasket out here. It'll roll the gasket out and you won't notice. And then you bolt everything down and you run the engine and it starts pouring oil directly onto your exhaust and making a huge mess. So just really be careful as you're actually trying to get this back into place that you don't roll that gasket. All right, it is finally time to actually install our high volume oil pump. It can be a little bit tricky to get it to line up with the splines here on the drive gear for the crankshaft, but just give it some wiggles back and forth until it fully seats against the block. If it's not fully seated against the block, do not use the bolts to try to draw it in. Just keep wiggling it until it goes clunk and falls into place. There we go, got it fully seated. Run your bolts in here and these bolts will get torqued down to 18 foot-pounds. Now that our oil pump's on there, we want to get that pickup tube back in place, but in order to do that, we have to put on the oil pan gasket first and then the pickup tube. This pan gasket is obviously like an integral windage trace type gasket. This goes on, then the pickup tube goes in place, then the oil pan after that. Now, something I want to note here about these oil pan gaskets, they are actually very good sealing gaskets. We generally don't see problems with these things leaking. And anytime I say that, people run to the comments and say, well, I had mine leak. Yeah, you're going to see a few of them out there, but by and large, this is not a common problem to have these leak. As such, when you install these things, you want to put a little bit of silicone in the corners here, basically right where that rear main seal matches up to the iron block and where the timing cover matches up to the iron block. Just in those 4 spots, you want to put a little bit of silicone. Do not put silicone all the way around the perimeter of this thing. Whoever ends up in there after you is going to absolutely hate you for doing that, and it's just not necessary. Like I said, these things seal really well. Another point to note here is that when you're installing these things, it can be kind of a pain because you put that silicone on there, then you're trying to fit this thing up into place, then you're trying to get the pickup tube in place and it's kind of flopping around. Something that I found is really helpful is I got a set of these basically oil pan holders, and these actually come with a lot of different aftermarket oil pan installation kits. They're just little plastic things that screw up into the block itself. And what happens is they have this little wedge shape here that as you slip the windage tray up over it, it kind of holds it in place for you. And then after everything's in place, you just unscrew them from the block and put the actual screws into place. I'm not sure where exactly to find something like this. I'll see if I can locate that and put it in the description down below, but I find these to be a very helpful tool when doing this job. Also note that I have a fresh oil pickup tube O-ring installed and it's properly lubricated, so I don't have any concerns about that O-ring being pinched or cut as I install it. Important thing to remember here while you're putting in the oil pan bolts, make sure to put all of them in first loosely before you try to tighten any of them. If you tighten some of them, chances are by the time you get to the last one, it won't want to go in. And if you try to force it, these things will break very easily. So start them all loosely first and then tighten from there. And it's time to put our timing cover back on. As mentioned before, we're going to put just a little bit of RTV right here in the corner and the same on the opposite side here. That's all you need to actually make sure this front timing cover is all sealed up. Also, don't forget to install a new timing cover seal, because chances are by the time you take this thing off, yours will have been through about 1,000,000 heat cycles and the rubber will become not so much like rubber anymore. It'll be hard and stiff and not really seal so well. It might have been okay until you took it off, but generally they don't work so well once you try to put them back on. So just replace it with a new seal. They're not very expensive. Now it's time to put our crankshaft pulley back on. The nice thing about these is that there's no keyway or anything. It can go on any way. I would use like a block of wood or something. Just give it a few taps on the end here. Get it started on the end of the crankshaft, enough to where you can get 3 or 4 threads on the crankshaft damper bolt. Then you can draw it in the rest of the way using that bolt. It generally slides on very easily. So as you're tightening it, you'll feel it go into a hard stop, and then you can torque the bolt from there. Now at this point, it's just reassembly to get everything back together again, and then I have a couple more tips for you before we actually start the vehicle. We're 95% reassembled here, and we are now adding our fluids. I added in some fresh oil here, exactly the same kind of oil that was in there before, 520 synthetic. Fresh oil filter on there. Now we're gonna add some coolant. Now the Hemi engine, it really has a problem with trying to trap air inside of it, so it can be a little tricky to get this thing to bleed out properly. My recommendation to you is there is a plug, an Allen plug directly on the front of the water pump. Go ahead and undo that plug as you're filling in the coolant until coolant starts pouring out of that plug, and then put the plug back in and top off your coolant from there. Basically, that's going to give you the best advantage as far as getting the coolant to bleed out of this thing properly. The real key is to get the thermostat to open. As soon as the thermostat opens, then it'll cycle properly. But if you've got a big air pocket in there, a lot of times that won't happen, and it just gets hotter and hotter and hotter. So really, that's your best effort. Now, of course, what I do at work is I have a vacuum coolant filler. What it does is it puts a vacuum on the entire cooling system, and then it'll suck the coolant into basically every area of the cooling system. So there's no chance for any kind of an air pocket to be in there. But I know a lot of you guys at home, you're not going to have that tool. So this is your best choice as far as filling the cooling system. We've got the truck all back together again. Now we're down to the last 2 things that we're going to do before we fire it up. The first thing is just a quick check that I always like to do when I get something back together, and that is if you have a code reader of some kind, check to see if you have any active codes. What this will do is it'll tell you if you forgot to plug something back in. It sure is a lot easier to plug it back in now while the engine's cold versus after the engine's been running and it's very hot. So that's the first step I like to do. Second thing is, because we've installed this new oil pump, we had the oil pan off, we had the oil pickup tube off, there was no oil in there, so now it needs to draw that oil back up into the system. So I want to crank the engine over while making sure that I'm getting enough oil pressure before I actually fire the engine. So what I like to do is I will pull the fuse for the fuel pump so we're not getting any fuel pressure, so the engine won't try to actually fire up. And I'll just keep cranking it over until I see that that oil pressure is coming up to where I want it to be. Then I'll put the fuse back in, we'll fire this thing up. Now, one last point of note here is that, of course, we are going to have some active codes. We took out those MDS solenoids, so those plugs are just chilling underneath the intake right now. So we're gonna have active circuit codes for all 4 of those solenoids. Now, in this video tutorial, we've only covered the mechanical side of deleting the MDS system. You still have to do it electronically as well through the PCM. That's not something I'm going to be covering in this video. You're gonna have to do your own research and figure out what sort of programmer or what sort of direction you want to go to take care of that side of things if you want to get rid of that check engine light. Okay, I've cranked it over enough to get that oil pressure where I want it to be. Let's go ahead and fire this thing up, see how she sounds. Actually, a little bit quieter than I expected it to be. Now, I don't know if you can hear it on camera or not, but there is a little bit of a tick happening there right now. But again, you just have to let these things run for a little while. And in fact, I recommend going through a full drive cycle, especially if you are keeping the MDS system on this thing. Let it go in and out of MDS a couple of times. That really helps to get all of the air out of these hydraulic lifters. So at least do a full drive cycle. If you still got noise after about 20 minutes, then something isn't quite right, but at least give it some time to quiet down. Okay, I just want to give you guys an accurate before and after comparison here. You can see that the truck is fully warmed up. It's sitting at 199 degrees, 203 degrees oil temperature, and we're currently sitting at 41 PSI while idling at about 600 RPM. Now, I will say that normally these 5.7 Hemis are generally in the range of 32 to 35 PSI fully warmed up. So this engine does seem to be fairly tight as far as that goes. I mean, again, only 85,000 miles on it, but still, it's a little higher than I normally see. Now, that could be because it's not that warm outside. You can see it's 45 degrees outside. So if this was the heat of summer, that oil would thin out a little bit more and we'd probably see a little bit lower pressure number. Now, interestingly, that does bring up another thing that a lot of people will ask me, that these numbers here that we see on the cluster, are these accurate or is it lying to us? Well, the good news is that these numbers are exactly what the PCM is seeing. There's no false advertising here. These are the accurate numbers. All right, status check of our engine oil pressure. It's about 45 PSI right now, 44, yeah, 44, 45 PSI. That's about where it's landing. I know there could be some of you out there who are thinking, well, you went from 40 PSI to 45 PSI. I mean, that's not really that big of a jump. And that's true, but really, it's simple math. We put in a pump that has 12% more volume than stock. What's 12% of 40? Well, it's about 4.5-ish, give or take. So 40 to 45 PSI. That's exactly the number we were expecting to see. And again, it's not really about the oil pressure number to me. It's more about knowing that I have that 12% higher volume of oil actually flowing through the system. Also, I want you guys to keep in mind that my pump was actually in extraordinarily good shape, that stock pump, so it was really performing quite well. If you have an older pump that's a little bit more worn out, you might see a bigger jump in PSI than I did. And it's a success. The truck is running great. I'm gonna go ahead and let it cool down a bit, burp that cooling system. We'll go ahead and top that off, but other than that, the truck is ready to go. Now, I know there's probably a few of you out there who are thinking, between the high volume oil pump and the MDS Elite, that was a ton of work, and you're not wrong. I am beat right now. I'm quite exhausted. It's a big job, but part of this video was to show you guys exactly what's involved with trying to do these modifications. But in my mind, I'm still very happy because I now consider this engine to be basically bulletproofed. I've addressed the major issues that afflict the Hemi engine. This thing is gonna go 200,000–300,000 miles with no problem whatsoever. The very last Hemi issue that you kind of see crop up, it's definitely much more rare than these, but they tend to have some valve spring issues sometimes. You'll have a valve spring that'll break. I will be addressing that in the future as well when I do swap to an aftermarket camshaft in there, get a bit more power and address the valve spring issue as well. But for right now, I want to thank you guys so much for watching this video and following along. Thank you again. Click those links, go to Summit, get you guys some parts, and we'll see you next time on Reignited.